There's a proverb in the Old Testament that says, "Many claim to have unfailing love, but a faithful person who can find?" Many claim to have unfailing love, but a faithful person who can find? The implication is, true faithfulness is a rare attribute. Faithfulness is something that's precious. In part, I think, because it takes courage. Faithfulness takes courage. Apologies for the Lord of the Rings reference. I know that's divisive, and not everyone's as nerdy as I am, but I've just read the books for the first time, and man, I love Samwise Gamgee. Isn't he a great character? He's basically faithfulness in a person, isn't he? Loyal to a T, steadfast in faithfulness, and he teaches us that faithfulness takes courage. In case you don't know the story, Sam's the character who's both the bumbling assistant to the protagonist and also the true hero of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He's the character who again and again makes ridiculously bold decisions, almost automatically, as if there's no other option, because he's so fiercely loyal to his friends. There's this moment I love where Frodo's decided it's too dangerous to go on together, and so he goes on alone. He rows out his boat, and moments later, Sam comes charging into the water, up past his neck, not actually knowing how to swim, eventually makes it spluttering to Frodo, and when he kind of comes to, he explains to him why he has to come with him. He says, "I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. A promise." You can hear I thought about doing the accent, can't you? You can hear it in your heads. I know. If you've seen the movie, you know it. "I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. A promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee, and I don't mean to. I don't mean to." I think Sam's such a good example of faithfulness. Steadfast in faithfulness, true to his word, unwavering in his commitment, loyal to his friends. And what a rare and precious thing it is to find true faithfulness. Well, as Christians, we should be standouts in faithfulness, because faithfulness is a Christian attribute. Just like love and gentleness and kindness are a fruit of the Spirit, so is faithfulness, attributes that the Spirit will make manifest in the life of a believer. Just like love and gentleness and kindness are things that Christians aspire to grow in more and more each day, well, so is faithfulness. So should faithfulness be. We should aspire to grow in faithfulness. And so that's where we're headed today. We're putting faithfulness under the microscope. What would it look like to be steadfast in faithfulness? And we're doing that because today's passage is all about faithfulness. Or really, today's passage is all about unfaithfulness. Last week we saw how God's people had fallen into spiritual apathy as life trundled on. They'd returned from exile. They'd settled back into life in Jerusalem, and they were going about their religious duties. But there was no joy in God. There was no sense of his closeness, no sense that he was really doing anything, no on-the-ground belief that he was with them. They just went about their duties because that's the way they had always done things. But then today we see that it wasn't just an apathy, but actually betrayal. Betrayal to their covenants, when he says in verse 10, "Do we not all have one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we profane the covenant of our ancestors by being unfaithful to one another?" I noticed two things there. First, that they had every reason to be faithful. They were all united in their belief under one creator God. They were all committed to keeping the covenant of their ancestors, to following him together as God's people. But secondly, that despite having every reason to be faithful, they were unfaithful to one another. Saying they were the people of God, going through the motions of religious behavior, but not really following him in their lives, not treating one another in a way that was consistent with who they claimed to be. See, Israel were in a covenant relationship with God. That's a relationship built on a promise. A bit like marriage is a covenant relationship between two people. The Israelites were in a covenant relationship with God. That is to say, God had promised to be their God, and they had promised to be his people. Now, a key emphasis in the book so far has been God's faithfulness to his promise. The book starts saying, "I have loved you," God says. The people ask, "Well, how have you loved us?" Which, by the way, is never a good response when someone says, "I love you." Say, "How have you loved me?" But that's what they say. And then from there it goes on to list the ways that God has been faithful to his people. He promised them from the beginning, you have I chosen, you are my people. And he's been with them ever since, through hard times, through wars, through disobedience, that despite them, he has stayed faithful to his people, steadfast in faithfulness. And the problem pointed out in 2 verse 10 is that, well, Israel seemed to have forgotten about their part of the deal. They were unfaithful in all sorts of ways. In fact, they were people that were characterized by unfaithfulness. That's the kind of people that they were, as harsh as that sounds. That's pretty hard news, but let's take a look at the facts. A key part of their covenant was to be faithful to God and God alone, not to mix with other gods, not to marry into other religions. Just let me read a part of what kind of is referred to as those ancestral covenants, the covenants made kind of on behalf of our people that we are committed to as a people. When Moses was given the law, it says, Moses bowed down to the ground at once and worshipped. Lord, he said, if I found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and sin and take us as your inheritance. And then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all the people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. And he goes on to talk about how they'll come into the promised land, drive out the nations before them. He says, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you're going, or there'll be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land. For when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they'll invite you, and you'll eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they'll lead you to do the same. Now, there's some language in there, there's some kind of spicy language in there, but what's it trying to get at? What did you hear as the emphasis there? It's don't worship any other god but me. That God sets in place fierce boundaries because he knows that as soon as they start to mix with the other people, as soon as they marry into the other faith, they'll find a middle ground. They'll compromise and they'll end up walking away from God. And so he puts in place fierce boundaries, which in Malachi 2 they should know. There should be no question as to what they should do there. And yet they've forgotten those covenants. They've walked away from them by marrying into the nations around them. And so that's the first thing, that by doing this, they've abandoned the covenant of their ancestors, but they're also unfaithful to their covenants with one another. And particularly, here is their covenant of marriage. They promised to the wife of their youth, I will always love you, and they've abandoned that covenant as well. They've moved on to other things when it no longer suited them. Read with me from 2 verse 13. It says, another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer looks with favor on your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. That's a consistent kind of complaint throughout Malachi. They feel like God is distant. They feel like he's not kind of following through on his promises. But they ask why? Why is God not accepting our offerings? Well, it is because the Lord is the witness between you and the wife of your youth. You've been unfaithful to her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. That's really helpful in understanding where the Israelites were at, that they were kind of a people characterized by unfaithfulness, not loyal to their covenants. But it's also really actually a fascinating insight into God's purposes for marriage. If you were married in the Anglican Church, you might have even drawn on some of these ideas in your marriage vows. On December 17, 2016, I looked Sophie in the eyes, I took her by the hand, and I said, with God and this congregation as my witnesses, I, Paul, take you, Sophie, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish you, as long as we both shall live. This is my solemn vow and promise. At that moment, we entered into a covenant together, built on promises, a relationship built on promises that we'd made before others, and with God and the congregation as our witnesses. So here it said that the Lord is witness between you and the wife of your youth. It's not just talking about God has an awareness of what's happening, but actually a witness in the legal sense, as in God, we are accountable to God for the promises that we make. Other parts of the Bible tell us that, it's God that brings two people together in marriage. What God has joined together, let no one separate. God is actively involved, actively invested in every marriage. And that's why in this moment it's shocking that these people are treating their covenants so flippantly, abandoning the wife of their youth to chase after whatever would be more convenient to them. And so as we keep reading from there, we naturally come to the topic of divorce. When we get to verse 16, it says that the man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect. Now, divorce is a really sensitive topic for lots of us in this room. I know that many of us, our lives have been touched by divorce in one way or another. And so what exactly is it teaching about divorce here? Well, God's purpose here is to rebuke husbands who paid no heed to the seriousness of the covenants that they made, and to protect the women who are mistreated and abandoned because of it. There are other passages in the Old Testament that make allowance for divorces under certain circumstances, but it seems that they were wrongfully divorcing their wives and mistreating the women they had a duty to protect. And so what are the takeaways for us? Well, it's helpful to see that marriage is a serious promise. A marriage is not to be entered into lightly, because God treasures your marriage. God comes as a witness to your marriage, and the divorce is not what he wants. And so if you're approaching marriage, maybe it's worth kind of reflecting on that commitment that you're making, not looking for compatibility first and foremost, but commitment. Being ready for the long haul, knowing that's a commitment that you're making. If you're a married person, well know that God is actively invested in your marriage. God treasures your marriage, and so guard it vigilantly. Seek help when your relationship flounders, and only to pursue divorce after much wise counsel and as a last regrettable step. But if that's hard for you to hear, or uncomfortable for some reason or another, whether you're in a difficult spot right now or whether you've been through that, the worst possible outcome from this would be for you to feel shamed, to feel like you couldn't talk about it, because actually in real life, marriage is really hard. And the thing that will help that is to seek wise counsel, to be able to talk about it. And so the worst case scenarios is for you to feel shamed, feel like you can't talk about it. Actually, the best thing would be to seek wise counsel. I'd be very happy to chat with you. I know any of the pastoral staff would as well, because we're starting a conversation. All of that said, now is obviously not the time for that, because in truth, this is not just a message for a few of us in the room, but for all of us. Whether in this particular way or others, all of us are guilty of being faithless to one another. And all of us must find our hope in Christ's faithfulness alone. Whether married or single or widowed or divorced, Jesus laid down his life for that of his faithless bride, the church, so that he might make us radiantly beautiful before him. 2 Timothy 2 verse 13 tells us that when you are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. When you are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. But that's where the Israelites were up to right then. From the very beginning, God had been steadfast in his faithfulness towards them, but again and again they showed that they were people characterized by their unfaithfulness. And Malachi summarizes in verse 17, "You have wearied the Lord with your words." But rather than repent, the people again questioned God. Just like at the beginning, he said, "I've loved you." They said, "Well, how have you loved us?" Now again, he says, "You've wearied the Lord." And they say, "Well, how have we wearied him?" The answer? Well, by saying all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he's pleased with them. That is, God must approve of all this evil happening. He's not doing anything about it. God must not care. Or in other words, where is the God of justice? The problem of evil is it's not a modern problem. For millennia, people have been looking around at the world and saying, why is God allowing this to happen? Where is the God of justice we read about? Why doesn't God do something? And so in response, God tells them what he's going to do. He says, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. And then suddenly, the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant who you desire will come. Notice two different messengers there. The first, the messenger who prepares the way. Like a royal herald clearing the highway for the passage of and arrival of the king. But then the second, the messenger of the covenant, is a different person. That, in fact, he's identified with the Lord himself. The messenger of the covenant, as in the one who reaffirms the covenant of God with his people. But if this is the one thing that they're seeking, the one in whom they're seeking, the one in whom they delight, well, verse 2 might make them reconsider that when he says, but who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. A refiner's fire, a launderer's soap. Those are images of the dirt and dross being separated out and eliminated. Getting rid of all the dirt and only being left with what's good. The refiner's fire is an image of God purifying his people. It's not a pleasant experience, but it is a good one. This is not a bushfire that wipes everything out. This is a refiner's fire. A fire with a purpose. Say they had gold which had impurities in it. The way that they would do it, they would heat the fire so hot that it would melt down the gold and incinerate anything else. Anything that wasn't gold would be incinerated. And then when the gold came back down to normal temperatures, it would be pure, without any of the impurities that were there before. All the dross burnt away. Which, if you're the gold in this story, it doesn't sound like a very fun process, but it is good, right? It's a good end result. And sometimes hard things are really good. And for the Israelites, that's the promise here. This is a hard process, but it's going to be good. Because the end result is what they've been longing for. It says in verse 4, then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness, and the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in former years. Remember, that's what they'd been weeping about just earlier in the chapter, in verse 13. That's what they've been longing for, is for their offerings to be acceptable before God, to be righteous before God, to be seen as right in his sight and be able to approach him freely. So that's the first thing, that like a refiner's fire and full of soap, God will eliminate all of the dross and dirt. God will purify and renew his people. And so the purified priest will lead God's people in worship that is pleasing to him. The second promise is slightly different in verse 5. He says, we move from the blacksmith's furnace to the courtroom when he says, so I will come to put you on trial. I'll be quick to testify against all the injustices and wrongs that he sees. The second promise is more final. They've asked, where is the God of justice? Well, he's coming. But he's patient. He's very aware of the injustices that go on. And he is coming to set things right. And when he comes, justice will be done. And so that's the promise. God will bring justice. He'll do that. He'll purify his people even through a painful process, and he'll bring justice for all the wrong that is done here. The question that we're left with is, did God come through on his promise? Has God done this? I mean, particularly, did Jesus do this? I don't know if you noticed that the themes back earlier when we was talking about a messenger who's going to prepare the way. That's really clearly fulfilled in John the Baptist. If you just read it kind of a few pages later, you'll see that in the Gospels, again and again, John the Baptist is talked about as the messenger who prepares the way. And then the second one, the one who's identified with the Lord himself, then that has to be Jesus, doesn't it? Who else has God himself come down, God's presence among us? And so has Jesus done this? Has Jesus kind of fulfilled those promises? Can we answer the question, where is the God of justice? Did he purify his people so that their priests would make acceptable offerings? Did he bring justice for all the wrong that is done here? And the answer is yes. Unequivocally, yes. But perhaps not in the way you might have expected. See, how did Jesus purify his people? Malachi talks about purifying in the white-hot flames, refiner's fire, to have their sins dealt with. Well, Jesus does that, but it's him who steps into the fire. So Jesus wipes away all of our guilt and stain before God. He washes us clean like launderer's soap, but not by putting us through the fire, by stepping into it himself. And so the New Testament says he's made. So how is that? How do we see the priests offering? Is that the end result, that the priest would offer the gifts that are acceptable to before God, offerings in righteousness? Well, who are the priests now? One of the great privileges of what Jesus has done is that there's not just a select few who have special access to God. It talks about how Jesus has raised for himself a kingdom of priests, so that we all might offer pleasing sacrifices to God. That's how Romans 12 talks about it. It says that our very bodies, our very lives are like a spiritual sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. See, it's not because we live righteously, but because we're clothed in his righteousness, that we can come before God. All of us have the privilege to come before him, and our very lives are holy and pleasing to him, not because we're perfect, but because Jesus was. And so does Jesus purify his people so that their offerings would be pleasing to God? Well, yes, unequivocally yes, but perhaps not as you might expect. Second part of it is, does Jesus' coming bring all things to justice? And again, yes, but perhaps not as you might expect. See, in Jesus, God shows his sense of justice. God shows how much he cares about the wrong that goes on around us. But he also shows God's patience. Because he brought justice not by eliminating all the sinners, like Malachi implies. Rather, he himself took the consequences of sin upon himself. The most serious consequence there could be, that God himself come down to die. God cares about the injustice that goes on around us. But he's also patient, and he's also merciful. And so Jesus stood in our place to show God's patience. But he also promises that when he returns, he will judge the living and the dead, fully and finally. He will bring to light all the evil that now remains hidden. And he will bring all things finally and fully to justice. The difference is that for those who trust in him, we're covered in his righteousness and have nothing to fear for our own faithlessness and the injustices that we ourselves commit. And so we started with the question, what does it mean to be steadfast in faithfulness? And there's our answer. There is no better place that we can learn than at the feet of Jesus. I mean, Samwise Gamgee is wonderful, don't get me wrong, but Jesus shows us what thousands of years of faithfulness to his people looks like, to faithfulness to his people and to his promises. Jesus shows us what it looks like to go through the fire for us. He purifies us so that we can bring our lives as pure and acceptable offerings, and he shows us both God's justice and God's patience at the cross. And he will, in the end, bring all things fully and finally to justice. Jesus, not Sam, but Jesus is faithfulness in a person. So would you pray with me, thanking God for the great faithfulness shown in Jesus? Heavenly Father, we thank you for Jesus. Thank you for his great and patient faithfulness to his people, despite our continued rebellion, despite our continued faithlessness. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you that though we remain faithless, he remains faithful. And we thank you that he's purified us so that we can bring our lives to you as pure and acceptable offerings. And thank you that we could be made right before you, that we would have nothing to fear.